On St. George's Day, 1377, two young boys stood before the altar in the chapel at Windsor Castle to be inducted into the Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in the land. The 10-year-old Richard was heir to the throne. The 11-year-old Henry Bolingbroke was his cousin and heir to the most powerful aristocratic family in England. The ceremony marked their entrance onto the public stage. The future of the English monarchy seemed assured as the two boys swore never to take up arms against each other.
It was a promise they couldn't keep. Instead, cousin clashed with cousin as Henry usurped Richard and made himself king as Henry IV. The usurpation triggered the worst crisis in the English monarchy since Magna Carta. Over the next 100 years, there were 7 kings, and only 3 of them died in their beds. 3 were murdered, 1 was killed on the field of battle, and 3 followed Henry IV's own example in violently usurping the throne. These bloody civil wars formed the background to Shakespeare's series of great history plays and their royal stars: the overweening Richard II, the heroic Henry V, and the pathetic Henry VI. In these wars, the whole basis of the English monarchy was questioned and upturned, and the royal house tore itself apart in a slow, painful suicide.
In England in 1370, the old and feeble-minded Edward III was king, a shadow of his mighty younger self. The hope for the future lay with Edward's eldest son and heir, the Black Prince. But then, in 1376, disaster struck. Aged 45, he died. In his place, his son, the 9-year-old Richard, became heir to the throne.
Honours and titles were now showered on the boy. He was made Earl of Chester, Duke of Cornwall, and Prince of Wales. He sat above his royal uncles at a banquet. He even opened Parliament on the old king's behalf. But a year later, Edward III was dead, and Richard, aged only 10, became king. At his coronation, he was anointed with holy oils. He was crowned with Edward the Confessor's crown, and the greatest bishops and earls knelt at his feet to pay him homage. One of the boy's toys was a set of dice, loaded so that he always won, and life must have seemed just as rosy for the lad, who grew up with a sense of his absolute, untrammeled right to power.
In reality, royal power relied on the support of the English nobility. Chief amongst them was the Duke of Lancaster, the father of Richard's childhood friend, Henry Bolingbroke. The House of Lancaster had 30 castles scattered across England. The jewel in their ducal coronet was Kenilworth, which far outclassed most royal castles in scale and in grandeur. Extravagances like Kenilworth were hugely resented by the common people of England. In the last 50 years, the Black Death had swept through the country 3 times, wiping out half the population. Rents had collapsed, and now landowners and the government were trying to recoup their position. In 1380, they introduced a new poll tax. Not for the last time, it triggered a revolt. The rebels' target was not Richard, but the noble clique around him. The rebels even flew the banner of St. George, and as they marched on London, they swore loyalty to their young king.
As the rebels looted and burned in the city and suburbs, Richard, his mother, and a handful of councillors took refuge in the Tower. The revolt was, of course, a terrible threat, but it was also an opportunity for the young king. The lords, who'd hitherto ruled England in his name, were suddenly powerless and directionless in the face of the triumphant mob. On the other hand, that same mob was crying enthusiastically for Richard as their true king. Richard took them at their word. Aged only 14, and with a courage that was fully worthy of his father, the Black Prince, he met the rebels 3 times, and proclaiming that he was now their captain, he led them to safety outside the city.
Having tasted real power, Richard was reluctant to give it up, but the nobility stood in his way. For they had grown even more rich and powerful in the French wars. From their castles across the country, these lords could call upon large bands of armed retainers. The Duke of Lancaster alone had 4,000 men at his command. Richard was determined to beat them at their own game and formed his own private army. They wore his badge of the White Hart as a sign of their loyalty.
This beautiful painting is known as the Wilton Diptych. It's a work of private devotion, and it takes us to the heart of Richard's intense, obsessive, solipsistic view of kingship, which raised him gloriously above his subjects and dangerously cut him off from them. Richard was born on the 6th of January, the feast of the Epiphany, when the 3 wise men or kings knelt in adoration before the Christ child and his virgin mother. So here, in the center of the picture, is Richard repeating that act of homage. The 6th of January is also the date on which the Church commemorates Christ's baptism by John the Baptist, who appears here beside the 2 English royal saints, Edward the Confessor and the Anglo-Saxon martyr monarch, Edmund. Even the angels surrounding the Virgin belong to Richard's dream world, as, like his earthly trusties, the Cheshire Archers, they wear his badge of the White Hart. With the heavenly host in his pocket, Richard thought, who could stand against him?
The answer in the real world was the men who actually held power, the nobility. And one of their natural leaders was Henry Bolingbroke, son and heir of the Duke of Lancaster. Only 10 years had passed since Richard and Henry had sworn never to take up arms against each other. But in the 10 years, the 2 boys had grown into very different men. Henry had turned into a man of action. He excelled at jousting and blood sports, and he had a soldier's harsh piety. But Richard had created a glamorous and luxurious court of which he was the glittering centre. Here, style was everything. Richard commissioned the first royal cookery book, and he invented the handkerchief. But this was more than style wars. It was a clash of political values. Richard believed that a king was God on earth. Henry, that he was a first amongst equals. The result was real war. Richard and his court favourites against the nobility. On the 19th of December 1387, the two sides met at Radcott Bridge, just outside Oxford. Richard himself did not fight. Instead, his army was led by his friend and favourite, Robert de Vere. It was Henry who led the rebel forces into battle. De Vere was defeated and fled into exile. Henry was victorious.
With Henry's defeat of his troops, Richard was powerless. News of the defeat was brought to him here at the Tower, where he was spending Christmas 1387. Soon the rebel lords arrived and mercilessly browbeat the king, threatening him with force and even with deposition. There was nothing for it but a complete and humiliating surrender. Richard's friends were executed or driven into exile. The kingdom was to be ruled by a committee of the lords, and even Richard's personal affairs were put into the hands of a board of guardians, as though he'd been a child or insane.
Richard was left only with the title of king, but it was enough. Slowly and painstakingly, he rebuilt his position and power. Adversity had taught him patience and cunning, and he had decided that revenge was a dish best eaten cold. The depth of festering hatred was clearly illustrated when his beloved favourite, Robert de Vere, died in exile. In 1395, Richard arranged a funeral for him. All the sometime rebel lords were obliged to attend, the very men who had fought against de Vere at Radcott Bridge. Richard placed a ring on the dead man's finger, and, in this quiet gesture, he signalled that vengeance would be his. By 1397, Richard was strong enough to strike, and one by one, those lords who'd rebelled against him met with his revenge. On trumped-up charges of treason, they were either executed or exiled. No one was safe. Amongst the victims was one of his own uncles, the Duke of Gloucester. Richard's was a triumph of divide and rule, but the king saved a special revenge for his cousin Henry. When Henry was involved in a quarrel with another noble, Thomas Mowbray, Richard ordered that the two men fight to the death in a judicial combat. God would be on the just man's side.
Richard's behaviour in the affair shows him at his most malign and vain. He deliberately played up the quarrel between Henry and Mowbray, and he'd chosen the means of settling it that showed off his own glory to the uttermost. But this was the pageantry of the Colosseum. For Richard would preside like a Roman emperor in the amphitheatre as the defeated man was stripped of his armour, dragged at a horse's tail from the field, and strung up on the gallows which stood ready. But in the event, Richard behaved more like a royal conjurer than a Roman emperor. For, just as the combatants were ready to charge, Richard, in a dramatic gesture, threw down his staff, stopping the fight and resuming judgment to himself. Henry the King ruled would go into exile for 10 years, and Mowbray for life. Thus, King Richard, like a demigod, struck down his remaining foes.